Imagine waking up to the sound of birds, sunlight piercing through the pine trees of your quiet mountain town. And just hours later, watching your house float down the street like a toy in a bathtub. Ruidoso, New Mexico, a name known for calm hikes and peaceful cabins, just became the site of one of the most terrifying flash floods in recent memory. Entire roads vanished, homes twisted and collapsed. A father and his children, gone, swept away in a violent river where a street once stood. This wasn't just water. This was nature unleashed, furious, sudden, merciless. And what made it even worse? It didn't have to happen. This is the story of how weather, wildfire scars, and human inaction turned a storm into catastrophe, and why Ruidoso may never be the same again. At first, there was only silence. The kind of silence only found in mountain towns like Ruidoso, where pine needles whisper and creeks flow gently through canyons once carved by ancient rivers. But on this particular day, the stillness was deceptive. A thunderstorm was brewing above the forested slopes, fed by unstable air and an invisible pressure few could see coming. By the time the rain began, it fell like bullets, heavy, fast, and unrelenting. Over 3 inches of rainfall pounded the hillsides within an hour, striking terrain still wounded by recent wildfires. These burned scars, the remnants of the South Fork and Salt fires, weren't just blackened earth. They were time bombs. With the vegetation gone and the soil scorched into a hydrophobic crust, the water had nowhere to go. It bounced. It raced. It gathered. Small creeks turned monstrous in minutes. Trickling brooks became brown serpents, thrashing their way through canyons and neighborhoods. Rio Ruidoso, the town's lifeline, surged beyond 20 feet, over 5 times its flood stage, in a matter of moments. And then, the warnings came. But for many, they were already too late. Flash flood emergency. Seek higher ground immediately. Avoid all flowing water. Sirens wailed. Alerts lit up cell phones, but the roar outside had already begun to drown out everything. What once was a quiet retreat was now the center of a perfect storm. Within minutes, the floodwaters turned Ruidoso into a war zone. In the neighborhoods of Gavilan Trailer Park and Alto, water burst through driveways and front doors. Families scrambled to move cars. Others rushed to higher ground with nothing but what they could carry in their arms. But for many, the current was already too strong. Vehicles were swept away like toys. Homes began to creak, shift, and collapse under the relentless surge. Trailers floated off their foundations and slammed into trees and bridges downstream. A single moment of hesitation could mean life or death. Entire roads vanished. White Mountain Road, Cedar Creek and Paradise Canyon, streets that once led children to school and residents to work, disappeared beneath a muddy torrent of logs, rocks, and debris. Bridges crumbled. Power poles snapped. What used to be paved roads now looked like rivers carved by centuries. Eyewitnesses described the horror. One man, standing on his rooftop, filmed as his neighbor's house was literally torn in half by the current. A woman clung to a tree for over an hour, screaming for help, while floodwaters tore at her legs. The Rio Ruidoso had become unrecognizable. What was once a peaceful stream cutting through the village had transformed into a violent, muddy monster, devouring everything in its path. And it was still rising. Panic set in. Emergency calls flooded the dispatch center. In Hollywood, a father and his 2 children were swept away while trying to escape in their truck. Their cries were lost in the roar of the flood. First responders arrived, only to find the road impassable, washed away beneath a wall of water and mud. Helicopters were dispatched, rescue boats launched, but in many cases, they were fighting a race against time and ghost. In Ruidoso Downs and Glenmore, entire blocks were underwater. Residents stood on rooftops, waving bedsheets and flashlight beams toward the sky. Some were barefoot, some had no phones, and others were stranded with elderly parents, pets, or small children, unable to move but refusing to abandon loved ones. Shelters began opening across the county. At Ruidoso Community Center, displaced families arrived soaked, shivering, and in shock. Staff handed out blankets and bottled water. The building quickly filled beyond capacity. Others were redirected to Eastern New Mexico University and local churches like Angus Church, now transformed into emergency havens. But the storm wasn't finished. As night fell, the water kept rising. Streets turned into rivers, basements became coffins, entire homes disappeared in silence, their last moments visible only through grainy cell phone videos. And still, no one could predict how much worse it might get. As the flood raged through Ruidoso, the town's infrastructure collapsed with chilling speed. Power lines snapped like twigs under the weight of falling trees and rushing water. Entire blocks plunged into darkness. For many, the only light came from lightning bolts flashing across the sky, or the occasional glow of a flashlight clutched in trembling hands. The Rio Ruidoso had risen from just over 1 foot to more than 20 feet in under an hour, an unprecedented spike recorded by the U.S. Geological Survey. Power stations failed, generators shorted, and communication towers, lifelines in a disaster, fell silent. Water clogged roads and flooded emergency routes. Ambulances couldn't reach victims. Fire trucks were forced to stop short of burning buildings as transformers exploded from water damage. Even 911 services were stretched to the brink. Inside emergency shelters, panic grew. There was no reliable cell service, no internet, no way to check if loved ones were alive or missing. Parents sat, huddled in corners, whispering prayers. Children cried, clutching soaked, stuffed animals. The South Fork and Salt fire scars had created a perfect storm. Burnt earth that deflected water like steel. The soil couldn't absorb anything. Instead, it bounced the rain straight into town, with debris choking storm drains and overwhelming riverbanks. Ruidoso had gone dark, and in that darkness, fear spread faster than the flood. While the flood's fury was undeniable, many asked, could this have been prevented? In the aftermath, the questions came like the waters, fast, relentless, and pointed. Local officials had long known the risks. The burn scars from the 2024 South Fork and Salt fires had rendered the land dangerously fragile. Scientists had warned, even moderate rainfall could trigger catastrophic flooding. Yet, much of the $16.8 million allocated for flood prevention remained tied up in red tape. Vital projects, like reinforced culverts, updated drainage systems, and early warning sirens had been approved on paper but never built. Meetings were held, reports filed, but on the ground, the town remained vulnerable. Residents expressed frustration and grief. One mother, now homeless, said through tears, "They told us they were preparing, but where were those preparations when the water came?" Social media lit up with criticism. Had dam releases upstream been timed poorly? Why weren't evacuation orders issued earlier? Why were warning systems still dependent on cell service, knowing full well that power and signal fail during floods? This wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a human one too, born from bureaucracy, neglect, and a failure to act before it was too late. For hours, perhaps even days for some, Ruidoso became an island. Bridges crumbled, roads collapsed, power grids failed, and the once connected mountain town was now completely cut off from the rest of New Mexico. No phones, no internet, no news. Just silence, interrupted only by the roar of the river and the distant chop, of a helicopter blade. In the highlands, families huddled together inside damaged homes, unsure if they had been forgotten. In lower elevations, others waited on rooftops, waving makeshift flags and hoping someone, anyone, was watching. Emergency crews did what they could, but with access routes destroyed, even helicopters had trouble navigating the wind and narrow canyons. Supplies dwindled fast, gas stations were submerged, stores were locked and empty. And the only updates came from battery-powered radios, repeating the same words. Do not attempt to leave. Shelter in place. In neighborhoods like Paradise Canyon, the name now sounded cruel. Water reached the windowsills. Inside, soaked family albums floated across living room floors. Outside, cars lay upended and lifeless in yards of mud. The physical isolation was brutal, but the emotional isolation cut deeper. No messages from loved ones. No way to know if help was coming. The town wasn't just underwater. It was alone. And then, finally, hope. In the hours that followed the worst of the flood, glimpses of humanity broke through the devastation. Helicopters returned, this time with medics, food and water. Search and rescue teams arrived from neighboring counties, slogging through debris and waist-deep mud to reach the stranded. In Hollywood, a firefighter pulled a young boy from the branches of a tree he'd clung to all night. In Ruidoso Downs, volunteers carried a wheelchair-bound grandmother to safety, one stair at a time. Strangers became heroes. Survivors became family. But the relief was bittersweet. Some homes were gone entirely. Others stood hollow, their walls torn open, their floors caked with silt and sorrow. The father and children reported missing, still unaccounted for. Pets never returned. Photos, keepsakes, the things that made houses into homes, gone in a blink. Still, people began to rebuild. Churches served warm meals. Schools opened their doors. Volunteers distributed blankets and bottled water. The town rallied, not just to survive, but to recover. But underneath it all, a haunting question lingered. What if this happens again? Meteorologists warned that with monsoon season far from over, more storms could come. And next time, the scars of this flood might make recovery even harder. But for now, in a gym lit by flashlights and filled with donated cots, a child laughed. And that sound, fragile and fleeting, meant everything. The skies over Ruidoso have cleared, but what remains isn't just broken buildings and eroded roads. It's broken trust, eroded confidence, and a question that haunts every survivor. Could we have been saved? This flood was not just an act of nature. It was a message, a brutal reminder of what happens when preparation is delayed, when warnings are ignored, when fire scars go untreated, and when resilience is left to chance. Scientists have long warned that as our climate shifts, events like this will become more frequent, more sudden, and more devastating. Ruidoso's tragedy is not unique. It is part of a global pattern, where towns burn in one season and drown in the next. And so the story doesn't end here. Because Ruidoso is not just a victim, it is a mirror, a reflection of what can happen anywhere, when nature meets negligence and water becomes a weapon. The rivers will recede, the mud will dry, but the people, they will remember. And if we're wise, so will we. Because the next time the rain falls, the difference between disaster and survival may come down to how well we listened to the lessons written in water.